massive traps, a thick neck, and shoulders that seemingly attach all the way up to your ears. That's what we're talking about when we use the term yoked. And the traps are a body part that's a bit more unique to develop than some of the others, in terms of the fact that most bodybuilders and lifters either have great trap development or just extremely poor traps in general. And it's not uncommon to see guys with great upper body development who still seem to have that dreaded pencil neck look. And then there's even bodybuilders with massive trap development that just take away from the rest of their physique. And while most people will chalk this up just to individual genetics, which certainly do play a role, over my decades of training and coaching, I can tell you, training, and more specifically how you train, is one of the biggest contributing factors for trap development. I can literally walk into a gym, see a guy completely covered up, and just watch the way he trains, and I can tell you 9 times out of 10, when that hoodie comes off, if he's gonna have great trap development or not. And how I'll know this comes down to 3 things. 3 universal training principles, or 3 things that I can confidently say everyone with great trap development does in their training, or at least has prioritized it in the past. And this even applies not just to bodybuilders, but average lifters, power lifters, strongmen, anyone that just trains with weights. But before I get to those 3 things, let me tell you what I did wrong early on in my training career, when I wasn't getting the training results that I was looking for, and before I finally implemented these 3 things, so that hopefully, if you are making those same mistakes right now, you stop. You get on the right track and you start making progress again. So let's rewind back to the early 2000s, 2005 era. Of course, a lot of training knowledge was limited back then. A lot of the methods I followed in the gym were found in magazines or just a few articles online. And back then, if you go to a store and you'd open up a Flex or a Muscle and Fitness, if you saw any bodybuilder with massive traps, it was usually some type of photo shoot done where they were performing heavy deadlifts, rack pulls, or barbell rows. The key here was they always had an absurd amount of weight on the bar. And fun fact, of course, later I found out that most of those pictures, the weights were fake. But nonetheless, you look at this stuff and you draw a simple conclusion. Heavy deadlifts and pulls equal massive traps. And while there is some truth to that, which I will get to in a little bit, I followed this idea pretty consistently for a long period of time. In my training, I would have things like days dedicated to conventional deadlifts from the floor. Every week, I'd also hammer rack pulls week after week. I was regularly going in the gym, loading up a barbell, and pulling 500 to 600 pounds off the rack. In the process, bending some bars and possibly pissing off some gym owners as well. And as a result, I was pretty strong. But I didn't have that yoked look yet. That's when, like many other times in my training career, I found myself just saying, screw this, let's try another way. And that's when finally, after years of trial and error, I came up with the 3 things that I find universally go into building massive traps. The first one, you have to be strong on upper body compound lifts. And while the traps are back muscles used primarily in pulling exercises, the traps actually assist to some degree in almost every upper body movement that you do in the gym. If you're pressing overhead, your traps are working. If you're performing a vertical pull, your traps are assisting. If you row, if you bench, even if you perform isolations like lateral raises, the traps are always involved, no matter how hard you even try to take them out of the lift. And as a result, even if you don't directly train them, if you get brutally strong on all upper body lifts, your traps are going to develop to some degree. And I would go as far to say that upper body strength is the prerequisite to massive trap development. And you'll also need that strength foundation for everything else that we're going to talk about here. And over the years of lifting, as my bench increased, as my overhead press increased, as I got stronger on my rows and my pulls, my traps grew as a result. But that is only one part of the equation. And if you just stop there, you're possibly going to come up short on your full potential. Number 2 is prioritizing the posterior chain. Initially, I was onto something with heavy rack pulls for trap development. But what I really should have been doing was focusing on better hip hinge variations that were more suited for hypertrophy. And the 2 that I feel personally go the furthest for trap development specifically are the Romanian deadlift and the trap bar deadlift. And like any other body part, if the goal is hypertrophy, you want movements with a large range of motion and ones that stretch the target muscle. And because you never set the weight down with an RDL, whether that's a barbell or dumbbell, you're loading not only the hamstrings, the glutes, and the lower back, but the entire posterior chain all the way up to the traps. And on something like an RDL, fully stretching those muscles and keeping tension on them throughout the entire rep of every set, that creates a greater stimulus to the target muscles, much more than something like a rack pull, despite the weight difference. And with something like a rack pull, you can simply just load up a ton of weight and have something like the hips and glutes come in and compensate just to lift that weight off the rack. Now, I know what a few people will say. No, Pete, rack pulls are goated for trap development. I've been there. I rack pulled over 500 pounds for 15 plus reps. My trap development was decent at best as a result. And today I do RDLs with no more than 365 pounds. And RDLs have done more for my trap development than rack pulls ever have. But hip hinges, again, are only one part of the equation. And the last part is perfecting your isolation work technique. Most people in the gym treat their shrugs the same way they treat their rack pulls. They load up as heavy a weight as possible, and they move that weight in the shortest range of motion. This is by far the worst way to train traps. And if you don't believe me, just walk into any gym, head to the squat rack, and I'm sure you're gonna see one guy in there shrugging with 5 or 6 plates on the bar. He's probably gonna be grunting and pulling that bar about an inch off the pins. And every time you see that guy, he will have no trap development. I've been in the gym over 20 years. Not once have I seen that guy with massive trap development. Now, the ones with impressive traps, those are the guys slowing down their shrugs, focusing on that deep stretch, and also pulling that bar up as high as possible, getting that huge contraction at the top. And over the years, I've played around with my form. And what I've found is that if I shrug with a slightly bent elbow, I could actually pull my traps even higher, creating a greater range of motion at the top of the lift. And instead of that textbook form of simply trying to shrug your shoulders up to your ears, when I shrug, I'm thinking, keep those elbows slightly bent. Now pull those elbows as high as you possibly can until those traps actually cramp at the top of the lift. And this easily allows me to pull that bar just a little bit higher on my shrugs. And at the bottom of the lift, let everything hang and stretch and pull those traps down. Now this significantly reduces the load of what I'm able to shrug with. But if you're strong on your heavy upper body compound lifts, and you're doing your hip hinges, you actually don't need a lot of weight on your shrugs. I went from someone at 185 pounds shrugging with 405 pounds with just decent trap development to now at 250 pounds using as little as 315 pounds on shrugs. But I'm actually getting much more out of that weight using this technique. So if you find that your trap development is really lagging behind, look at those 3 things. Are you getting stronger on your upper body compound lifts? If not, make that a focus before anything else. That's the foundation of your trap development. Are you focusing on your heavy hip hinges? Even if you're someone that's skipping legs or you think hamstrings aren't a priority for you, if you skip hip hinges, I promise you, you're leaving gains on the table even for your upper body. And when you do train shrugs directly, are you focusing on weight or are you focusing on taking the traps to a full range of motion using the appropriate weight? Now, if you do all these 3 things, I guarantee you're gonna have massive trap development. And if you want the exact training programs that I personally recommend to build more muscle using proven old school bodybuilding methods, all my old school mass gain programs are down below. And as always, if you wanna see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.